Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Meyer. I'm the Food Campaigns Director here at Green America, and really happy to have you here with us today. So I run Green America's consumer education and corporate campaigning work around food and agriculture, which includes our GMO Inside campaign, which is dedicated to getting GMOs and toxins out of our food system, and our recently launched Restore It campaign, aimed at educating consumers about regenerative agriculture, and then our Climate Victory Gardens program, which we are going to be discussing today. Thank you all so much for joining today. I'm really excited to have you here, and feel free to ask questions along the way. So before I start specifically talking about climate gardens and our plan for that, I am going to just talk a little bit about where we are with the climate change issue and how carbon specifically plays a role with that, and where community gardens or gardens have the potential to play a big impact in mitigating climate change. So as you are well aware, climate change is really one of the most pressing issues of our time, and has resulted because gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide have trapped heat into our atmosphere. Most of these occur naturally. These do occur naturally, but they don't occur naturally at the levels that we're currently seeing, and it's really a result of human activity, specifically agriculture, that has increased their quantity and persistence in our atmosphere and led to climate change. So there's going to be a graph on the screen soon, but it's not up yet. But NASA has been tracking our historical rate of carbon in our atmosphere, and we're currently at 407.62 parts per million. And you can actually track the carbon level on a daily basis via the Bloomberg Carbon Clock, which we'll put in a link for. And when the US started measuring atmospheric carbon in 1958, we were at 316 parts per million. And many scientists consider really the danger zone where we're at serious threat to be 450 parts per million. And that's the level where everything kind of goes haywire. There's an increased catastrophic storms and life on Earth really becomes threatened. So here's the graph showing where we are and where we used to be. So as you can see, historically, our carbon level was it bounced around kind of through a similar place and has just skyrocketed up over the last 60 to 70 years. And so the goal is to get that carbon level back down to 350 parts per million. And this climate change is causing sea level rise, decrease in our Arctic ice, increase in mega storm events like we've seen over the last couple of years. And obviously this is a serious issue and poses a great threat to how we live life, but just about the sustainability of the planet too. And so we really need a big solution to fight this. So while cutting back on things like fossil fuel use is really important for making sure that we don't continue to increase our carbon level, we also have to figure out a way and take action to undo what we've already done and bring that carbon level back down and sequester carbon back into the earth. So like I said, climate change is already having impacts on how we live. It's having major impacts on agricultural production, impacts from storms. We've had a lot of mega storms over the last couple of years. And this year, we're even seeing that impact the Florida citrus crop. We're not sure what that crop will look like. And that's a direct result of some of the most recent storms. There's major impacts on regional growing patterns. So increased and elongated droughts, like the 5-year mega drought we just saw in California. Changes in temperature, and this really affects growing seasons. So a shorter winter and a longer summer affects typical growing seasons in a region. And this changes in weather also affects water access downstream. So a light snowfall where there's usually a heavy snowfall is going to affect water access throughout a region from areas that depend on that water source typically. And then, of course, warming oceans. And this means we're losing our fisheries. So the ecosystem in the ocean is shifting as the ocean heats up, and we're losing our consistent access to fish as a food source. And then less carbon in the soil requires more external inputs and is just continuing our dependency on fossil fuels, which is really how we got where we are. So as our soil is depleted, we continue to rely on external inputs. And if we continue this destructive cycle, we're just going to dig ourselves deeper into a hole. So like I said, one of the ironies kind of is that climate change is impacting agriculture, but that agriculture is one of the major historic contributors to climate change. So those farming practices that were really promoted and glamorized by the Green Revolution, such as mechanized tillage, nitrogen-based fertilizers made from fossil fuels, monocropping, so relying on a single crop season after season, increased mechanization, and getting rid of a lot of those beneficial practices like crop rotation and cover cropping, those are really what got us where we are. So they cause carbon to leave the soil, they decrease soil health, and they increase our use of emissions in agricultural production. The one kind of silver lining is this, is since we've already depleted our soil so badly and taken so much carbon out, there's lots of potential to draw carbon back into the soil and use the soil as a carbon sink, drawing that carbon out of the atmosphere. And so that is a positive. So I'm not sure if many of you have heard of Project Drawdown, but they've compiled a lot of existing research and practices and found about 100 ways that we can reverse the carbon trend. So practices that are proven to work that we can start implementing immediately. And many of these practices and changes, suggested changes, are related to farming and agriculture and how we consume food. And the main thing that they notice is that we need to restore our soil of the carbon loss by historic conversion of forest and prairie to farmland to help mitigate greenhouse gases. So the numbers listed to the left of the items are actually how they're listed in priority through that list of 80 suggested practices that we implement. So 3, reduce food waste; 4, plant-root diet, decreasing our animal consumption, animal product consumption; 11, regenerative agriculture; 16, conservation agriculture; 19, managed grazing; 23, farmland restoration; 24, improved rice cultivation; 60, composting; and 67, farmland irrigation. And there are a few other agriculture-related ones, but that are very much just related to industrial scale. One of the great things is a lot of these suggested practices, such as composting, managed grazing, farmland irrigation, are part of a regenerative agriculture system. So by focusing on 11, regenerative agriculture, and implementing that on a large scale, we really have an opportunity to affect carbon in a variety of ways. So it's very clear that change is needed as on a massive scale. You know, we need to shift how we farm and how we participate in agriculture throughout the country and throughout the world in order to sequester enough carbon to make drastic change and get back to that 350 parts per million. And so Drawdown proposes that these changes happen over the next 40 years. Green America's goal in working with partners and allies is to get 30% of agriculture under regenerative ag practices by 2030, so 30 by 30. But we need to start somewhere, and we need to start immediately. And that is kind of where our idea for Climate Victory Gardens comes into play, and what we see as a launching point for changing how we look at food and how we grow our food. So the idea of Victory Gardens is not new at all. I'm sure many of you have heard about them. But during World War I and World War II, much of the traditional labor force, food supplies, transportation resources was diverted to the war efforts. And it really increased and presented a need for home-level production of food. And it was extremely successful. By 1944, an estimated 20 million Victory Gardens produced roughly 8 million tons of food, which was equivalent to a little bit more than 40% of all the fresh fruits and veggies consumed in the United States at the time. So there is a lot of potential for impact in just shifting how we farm in our own yards and communities. One vegetable gardening expert notes that a typical 20-foot by 30-foot garden produces about 380 pounds of produce, which is worth more than about $600, and that's just in one growing season. And a recent study by the University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB, shows that household gardens could play a major contribution to meeting climate goals. The study showed that gardens contributed 3.3% of greenhouse gas emission reduction goals for unincorporated Santa Barbara County by the year 2020. 0.5% of the goals for the city of Santa Barbara for 2050. And if you extrapolate that for the whole state, 7.8% of the goals for California for 2050 50. Sorry, that was a lot of numbers. But it really does show that a single household garden itself may contribute minimally, but if we look at this at scale and the ripple effect it could have, and if practices in gardening were implemented nationwide and worldwide, the implications for impacting our climate goals could be huge. And so the idea of climate victory gardens is that we really are able to take an active role in fighting climate change and bringing this dialogue and this discourse and these practices to our homes and communities, and creating an urban representation of the type of agriculture that we want to see in our country. So what does it actually mean to have a climate victory garden, and how do you start one? So we 100% recognize that every climate victory garden is going to look different, and we encourage diversity. It's really important. But so by committing to this set of climate victory garden commitments or principles that are up on the screen, we're really encouraging people to commit to garden in the spirit of climate change mitigation. So we understand that not all these principles can be implemented everywhere by everyone, but we encourage people to kind of do their best and commit to incorporating as many principles as possible, with hopes that over time, with experience, you can incorporate more and more of them. But some of them just aren't going to work where you live. You're just not going to be able to raise cows in your suburban or urban home. That's just not how it works, and that's okay. Like I said, the main goal is really getting people to garden in the spirit of climate change mitigation and getting increased carbon sequestration at a small scale. So I'm just going to go through the list of these commitments and explain why they're of value and what actions would be taken to kind of meet that commitment. So growing edible plants. The preference is that you're actually gardening to grow food. This reduces food miles, decreases your grocery shopping and therefore your grocery bill. It's encouraging seasonal eating and establishing a close relationship with food. One of the things we really struggle with in this country is that most people don't know what their food comes from and doesn't know what it looks like. You know, most children wouldn't know that there are purple carrots unless they're lucky enough to have parents who, you know, shop at Whole Foods. But so really building that connection to our food and establishing community around growing food. So to do that, plant your favorite foods, plant things that you know that you're going to actually eat all season long. And it's an opportunity to share with your neighbors. And this is really just, it's an ignition point for starting the dialogue around climate change and around farming practices and carbon sequestration. And that's one of the biggest kind of cultural benefits of shifting how we garden. Keeping your soils covered. So this is really important. One of our biggest issues nationally is that our soil is bare so much throughout the year. Exposes it to topsoil loss, runoff, its lack ability to absorb water and energy. So keeping your soils covered decreases your water use, it curbs erosion, and it's going to protect local water sources by acting as a filter for water. And so what you can do to implement this is apply mulch, leave plant residues. So when an annual crop is done for the season, rather than pulling that whole plant out of the soil, you can just top off the top and leave the roots in the ground to actually let them be absorbed by the soil, help build up the soil, and also help keep that soil in place. You can plant cover crops. There's lots of options for cover crops, clovers and things like that. And then you can strategically allow weeds. Weeds do serve a purpose. They're an annoyance, but they're not always bad. And it's finding that balance to keep weeds in the soil and keep your garden going. Encouraging biodiversity above and below the ground. One of the biggest things about gardening in a way that supports carbon sequestration is building up soil health. And the difference between soil and dirt is that soil is alive. It's a living thing. It's its own biosphere, and it's full of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, and those are all really essential to building up soil health, creating strong and healthy plants that can fight off diseases and pests, but also creating soil that can sequester carbon. It's also going to ensure much more nutritious food, the healthier soil you have. And yes, it balances the ecosystem of the area. So you want to plant as many different plants as possible. You want to alternate plants through different seasons, and make sure to feed your soil. Like I said, it's a living being and it needs food. So organic compost and manure and natural fertilizers such as that are really important in keeping that soil life thriving and healthy. And then obviously pollinator plants, habitat, so plants that attract pollinators, because you want to build up those beneficial insects, because just like not all weeds are bad, not all insects are bad. They serve a very important purpose in the ecosystem of your garden. Planting perennials is really important. So growing food isn't going to be an option for everyone, and so planting perennials is one way to really participate in carbon sequestration efforts. And so we're talking about perennial grasses, wildflowers, things that come back season after season. But there are also lots of opportunities for vegetables and fruits that are perennials, shrubs, bushes, herbs, so berries, basil, as well as things like asparagus that can come back season after season. And planting perennials also reduces the soil disturbance. So you want to disturb your soil as little as possible to help it keep that life going. And planting perennials as your main choice is one way to do this. Ditching the chemicals. So chemicals have a huge input, and we've really seen this at scale with industrial agriculture and the impact they've had on our food system and our environmental and human health. And it is a bit of a transition if you're used to using pesticides for weed control to go to more natural methods, but it's definitely doable. And it's really important for decreasing runoff and ensuring the health of your community and your family. And there are lots of opportunities to fertilize with compost, planting companion crops. So tomato and basil grow really well together. They kind of have a symbiotic relationship, and planting crops that have that relationship together will help ward off pests and create a more successful garden. And then there's all sorts of forms of integrated pest management that really help to keep pests away in more natural ways. Composting is great because it's something that almost anybody can engage in. It's just different depending on where you live. So everybody's going to engage in it differently. If you live in an urban area, you really have to protect your compost pile, using a barrel, or we just built a huge compost system here at my house that has just tons of chicken wire to keep rodents out. And if you can't actually compost in your own yard, there's a good chance there's somebody in your community, either a neighbor or school or community garden that's composting, that will accept your compost in. And then it's just a matter of keeping it in a pail in your home, or keeping it in your freezer is a really good place to keep it to make sure it doesn't go bad. And compost has so many benefits. It repurposes the waste. It prevents waste from going to landfill, which reduces methane, one of those greenhouse gases impacting climate change. And it's going to increase the quality of your soil and help feed that soil health and all those microorganisms and help provide more nutritious food. And you can compost kitchen and yard waste. It's actually really important to have a balance between brown, dry, leaf items in your compost and those more wet green items from your kitchen. So it's a good combination to work with your yard. Integrating crops and animals. This is one of those ones that is really important, but we understand that can only happen in very few yards. If you're able to raise chickens in your backyard, it's a great thing. It can really help with decreasing pests, and has a natural way of fertilizing, which is really wonderful. But it's a little tricky for most people, especially if you live in an urban area. There are all sorts of regulations regarding raising chickens in your yard. But if you can't, raise animals in your yard, one great way to incorporate this is finding a good source of animal manure you can find a local farmer or such that might have excess manure that you can use on your farm. And that's a great way to bring it back into the system, and a great natural fertilizer. Use people power over mechanization. So on a large scale, we're talking about degreasing, mechanized tillage, and things like that. But at home, even just hand pulling weeds, raking or sweeping instead of using a blower, using a push mower instead of a gas powered mower, biking to your garden if you're farming at a community garden, or biking to your grocery store. These have huge implications for fossil fuel use and dependency, and decreasing emissions, and even costs. It's a great place to start. So rotating plants and crops. As I mentioned before, this is a practice that's stopped on an industrial level, but is so important at a home garden. It ensures that there's balanced soil nutrients, and it helps keep pests to a minimum, which helps reduce any chemical inputs you might need. So different crops require different things. You have nitrogen fixing crops, you have crops that pull nitrogen out of the soil. And so it's really important to plan your garden accordingly, make sure you have a good balance, and then make sure you're not planting the same crop in the same place season after season, and making sure that you're moving things around and really switching to allow that soil to recover and rebuild, and make sure that there's a good nutrient balance. And then get to know your garden. It kind of seems a little obvious, but to learn the details of the soil and region you're working with. Every area geographically, regionally has different climates, and every soil is different. And so what might work on your neighbor's farm isn't going to work in your yard. And so it's important to take the time to figure out, how does your soil absorb water? What is it lacking? How much sun are you getting a day? How does your soil handle storm water? And this is going to really impact the practices you use, and how successful you are at gardening, and what type of plants you choose. So those are the commitments. And again, like I said, they're not going to work for everybody, but we're hoping to, these commitments or practices are really based off the actual methods for industrialized regenerative agriculture and what would it look like at a large scale. But this is a smaller version for what it might look like in your yard or your community garden or at your kids' school garden. And it's a great starting place for a way to bring back soil health. So moving on, I'm just going to talk about kind of the short list of things that you should do when you're starting a garden, because I know it can be really overwhelming to think about if you haven't started a garden before, or if you're trying to think about gardening in a different way. So the first thing you really want to do is get your soil tested. There's, I would say, two main reasons to do this. One is a safety issue. You want to make sure that your soil is safe to grow food in, that it doesn't have excessive amount of heavy metals, especially in urban areas. We used to use lead in our gasoline, so a lot of soil in urban areas has heavy levels of lead. And if this is the case, you do find out you have heavy metals in your soil, there are a couple options. You can do some mitigation techniques, like growing tons and tons of sunflowers. Sunflowers pull heavy metals out of the soil. One thing you have to know is that you want to throw those sunflowers away, not compost them, because if you compost them, you'll just be putting them back into the soil, putting those heavy metals back in. There's all sorts of ways that you can augment your soil to make it stronger and more balanced. And then, of course, you can always build a raised bed and garden in that way and bring in new soil. No, that isn't strengthening the soil, in your yard necessarily, but it's still an opportunity to sequester some carbon. So it still contributes to reaching our goals. And then the other reason is just to figure out the kind of nutrient level of your soil, to figure out the pH level if your soil is lacking in some specific nutrients, and to figure out what kind of microorganisms and life there is in your soil, so that you know kind of an understanding of how healthy your soil is. If you figure out that your soil is super lacking in nitrogen, and then you want to plant a lot of nitrogen fixing crops, getting a soil test will inform you of that. And a great thing is, a lot of land-grant universities actually do soil testing for free. So like in Washington, D.C., the University of District of Columbia, which is the only urban land-grant university in the country, they do free soil testing. So they have some great guidelines. You can send in a variety of samples, and they'll test your soil and let you know what's in it and how it's doing. And that's really important for then setting up the plan for your garden. So like I said, depending on where you're growing food, what you like to eat, you want to have a solid plan for what you're going to grow when, and when you need to start seedlings, and when you need to plant stuff. And this will just really kind of be your roadmap for planting. Buying your seeds is really important. There's so much variety out there, but you do want to buy plants that are going to succeed where you live. We love Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds as a seed company. They have lots of options, lots of organic seeds. They also just have an amazing seed catalog that you can pick up really at any bookstore or order online. And it's so beautiful. The names of the plants are so fun, and the colors and varieties of fruits and vegetables are just incredible. So actually do want to go back, Kristen. And then you want to go ahead and start your seedlings. So this really depends on where you live. So I live in Southern California. I don't have actual need to start seedlings. I can really put seeds in the ground at any time of the year just because of our climate here. But if you live somewhere where it's snowing right now, you want to get your seeds growing and get your plants started. And so starting your seedlings indoors is a great opportunity to do that. Also, if you do have soil that's not so healthy and is still kind of in a recovery process, putting a seedling, a more mature plant into the ground is going to thrive a lot better than putting a seed straight into the ground. We also, though, have issues with critters coming and taking the seeds. So that's another reason to go ahead with a seedling instead of just a seed. But now's the time to really purchase your seeds and start any seedlings you might want to grow. And then build your beds. Obviously, if you are not working with the soil in your ground and you're going to build an above ground bed, there's some actual construction that needs to be done. But even if you're building straight into the ground, you really want to form your beds, start adding in your additives, so compost, any soil amendments you need, any natural fertilizers, to start kind of getting that life back into the soil before you plant your seedlings into it or your seeds. And there's a variety of different methods you can use for soil preparation. If your soil is really lacking in nutrients, a great idea is to do a compost tea. So that's kind of taking some really great healthy compost and creating a really like thick tea almost to kind of just drench your garden bed in, and that helps get some of those good bacteria going and things like that. And then it's time to plant, which is always very exciting. And just like it's important to plan your garden, it's really important to track the life of your garden. So kind of keep track of when things went in and how they're progressing and what's happening with water and sun, because that'll inform how you garden for years to come. And I think one of the biggest things about gardening is showing yourself grace. It is not an exact science. It can be very messy, and sometimes you can do everything right and things just don't work out. And especially if you're working with poor soil and trying to recover it and build up that soil life, it's not going to be necessarily as easy to get things to successfully grow. But as your soil health increases and as you have less issues with pests and weeds, your garden's really going to thrive. But just be patient and know that everybody struggles with their garden, and that's part of the process. So some resources. I mentioned before land-grant universities. So the USDA has funds over 100 land-grant universities throughout the nation. These are universities that are given funding to do research on farming and gardening. And then there's also USDA extension agencies throughout the country. And one of the great things about these is that they have localized research and knowledge. So really information for your area where you're growing food, because it's going to be different where you are. And so you want to get the most localized information you can. And that's a great place to start. Usually land-grant universities also have a series of education programs as well. So classes that you can take that are relatively inexpensive. Your local arboretum, there are arboretums all over the country. And this is another great way if you're intimidated by gardening, if you haven't done it before, to get involved. Arboretums always need volunteers, but they also do classes. Lots of them host master gardener programs, which aren't necessarily food gardening specific, but do give you great amount of knowledge about gardening and soil health and plant varieties and things like that. And local arboretums also usually sell plant varieties that work really well in the region that they're located. So if starting seedlings or planting seeds is a little intimidating and you want to start just with some actual mature plants, you can go ahead and get some of those at your arboretum, and it's just going to be a much better wealth of knowledge and localization than you're going to get from like an Ace Hardware or Home Depot. Your public library is also a really great resource. It's super great to look into research and particulars about your area, and your library is going to have books and sources that are specific to your region. So if you're in Virginia, they're going to have books related to growing food in Virginia and gardening in Virginia, and potentially even your more specific area. So that's a great place to start. There are a lot of amazing books out there. We'll be putting out resources on our website about different books in the future. But if you just want an overall basic understanding of urban farming and gardening, the Essential Urban Farming, it's right here, is amazing. It goes over everything: how to plant your garden, how to build beds, how to pluck a chicken if you're doing that. And it answers a lot of questions and is really geared towards growing in small areas and growing in an urban area. And then if you're just curious about carbon sequestration and where we are with the climate change issue and how agriculture can be a part of that solution, the Project Drawdown book is really wonderful. It gives explanations about all 80 proposed solutions to the carbon crisis. And it's also just really beautiful to look at. It has some really great imagery. And then the carbon farming solution is very, very sciencey and goes into the detailed science of regenerative agriculture and carbon sequestration and different practices at an industrial scale. So it's pretty intense, but if you're really intrigued by this and you want to learn more, it's a really great resource. It's pretty much a textbook of information. And then the Green America blog. So you can go to greenamerica.org/climate victory gardens, and we're going to be putting a lot of information and resources out there over the coming weeks and months to help people kind of get started in this process. And then we're going to be gathering commitments from people who are committed to gardening in this particular way to really focus on carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation. And we will be tracking commitments and actually mapping where efforts are taking place across the country. And the URL for that is on the next slide. And that's pretty much all I have. So I'm happy to answer any questions or go into anything in more detail if you'd like. I don't know, Kristen, were there any questions also that came in earlier that that we should answer? Great. So earlier, a few people had submitted questions before the webinar, so I'll answer those. So are there any disadvantages to hydroponic tower gardens? I would say one of the big disadvantages, if you're aiming to sequester carbon, if climate change is something you care about and you want to garden in that manner, then a hydroponic tower isn't going to do that. One of the other issues is just when you look at nutrients, I mean, there are a lot of studies questioning whether nutrients are higher in plants grown outdoors or plants grown through hydroponics. But to me, one of the biggest issues is it requires a lot of external inputs. So you have to feed the water and provide those nutrients some way. And a lot of that is heavily processed. So it's definitely an option if you're growing indoors and that's your only option. It's one way to produce food and to cut down on the food you're producing outside. So it does have its benefits, but you're not helping sequester the carbon in the soil. So Joan asked about how about expanding the commitment to reducing lawn, planting trees, and in general adding more landscapes. Yes, I think this is a huge thing. You know, that lushy green Midwestern grass that we've planted everywhere that requires so much water is beautiful, but it shouldn't be grown in a lot of places. I mean, we grow that here in Southern California, and during the drought, most people just let their lawns die because there was just no way to water it. It also doesn't really build up healthy soil. I mean, most of that soil under Your typical lawn grass is really kind of concrete-like. It's not going to absorb a lot of water. There's going to be lots of runoff. So planting a more native grass, just redoing your landscape in general, planting flowers. We've turned our front yard into raised beds and are just growing food. It's actually technically illegal in our city. But it's one way to be a little bit of a rebel. But yeah, planting bushes, planting shrubs, planting trees, those all sequester large amounts of carbon, and they're perennials. So you don't have to replant them year after year, and it's going to help a lot with keeping soil in place and building up that kind of ecosystem in your yard. And another question submitted earlier was, how can mosses be promoted for sustainable gardens? Moss can be a great thing to use. Again, it's a perennial. It's going to sequester a lot of carbon, and it has a lot of ecosystem services. It also is really great at filtering water and preventing runoff and holding that soil. So say if you have open space and live in an area where moss is going to thrive, doesn't do so well in hotter climates, it's a great thing to use, and can be a great alternative to grass. Yeah, so Patricia just brought up in the chat the idea of mosses. Yeah, depending on the region, they're really a great option, and they're not super expensive, and definitely a great thing to incorporate. Okay, unless anybody has any other questions, I think we're going to end it. I'm more than happy to ask questions. You can email me at ameyer, AMEYER, at greenamerica.org, and definitely check back to learn more about what we're doing next and our resources for gardening. Thank you so much for joining today. We really appreciate you showing up.